We are asking schools to collaborate with us as we make evidence-based decisions about grades for each student in each subject across Cambridge IGCSE, O-Level, AS and A-Level and Cambridge Pre-U. I'm Zoe Neville-Smith, Communications Manager at Cambridge International. I'm joined by Rachel Bateman, who is our Senior Assessment Advisor, Assessment Standards and Quality. Rachel is here today to talk through some of the questions that schools have around the gathering and use of evidence in setting predicted grades for their students. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Zoe.
Okay, so Rachel, what kind of evidence can schools use to make judgments about their candidates' attainment?
Okay, as a subject teacher, you should use all of the evidence that's available to you to determine the candidate's predicted grades, so that you can make sure the judgment you make is as objective and accurate as possible. We trust that you will use your professional judgment to use the evidence available to you in an appropriate way. We understand that different centres may gather different combinations and amounts of evidence. Make a judgment based on what you've got. We're asking you to make an overall judgment, which might mean combining different pieces of evidence in an holistic way. Review whatever evidence you can gather of your candidate's performance.
And what would constitute appropriate evidence in these circumstances?
Okay, here are some examples of appropriate evidence that you might want to use. You could start with classwork. This could be evidence that you have from your candidate's workbooks, marks from assessed activities that have taken place during the course, feedback that you've given to them or to their parents and carers on their performance. Have a look at coursework as well. If the syllabus has a coursework component, look at any evidence you have of the candidate's level of performance in this work, the marks and any feedback you've given to the candidate. The feedback could be the general feedback you've given them in their production of the coursework, and any evidence you have from the final draft of the candidate's work, particularly if this was for a moderated component where you would have provided marks and a final annotated draft ready for submission to Cambridge. If the coursework was due to be examined by Cambridge, use the published marking criteria for the piece to make an assessment of the mark you think the candidate would have received for this piece of work. You can also use assignments or projects the candidates completed that are relevant to the syllabus content. These might not have formed part of an assessed coursework component, but might have been used as a teaching and learning tool to allow candidates to practice a skill or develop their understanding of a concept. As well as this, mock exams can be really useful, especially if they were based on past papers, marked using the mark scheme for the paper, and if they were taken in exam conditions. But be aware that candidates can perform in different ways in mock exams, and you should consider when the exam was taken and in what conditions when you evaluate how useful this evidence is for you to predict their later performance. You can use work the candidate has produced remotely since your school has been closed, but you should be confident that it's the candidate's own work and review whether it's in line with the evidence that you've seen of their performance previously. You can also consider information you've gathered from baseline tests, such as Yellis and Alice tests from Cambridge Ken, or other external tests. If the candidate has taken the syllabus in a previous series and was planning to resit the syllabus in the June 2020 series, or if they'd taken an AS qualification in a previous series and they were planning to carry this forward as part of an A-level in the June 2020 series, you should use their performance in this previous series to provide a strong indication of how they would have performed if the June 2020 examinations had taken place.
And Rachel, is there any evidence that you'd say schools shouldn't be using?
Well, firstly, I'd say that you must be able to authenticate any evidence that you use. If you're reviewing candidates' work remotely, you can authenticate it by checking in with your candidates regularly about their progress. You can ask your candidates to submit their work, their draft work, electronically for you to review where it's appropriate. And you can supervise your candidates' work using online systems with video capability, as long as you've been given the necessary permission to do this. If the candidate has produced work independently and you're not able to authenticate it, you should not use it to form your judgment. confirmation of authenticity from parents or private tutors who you do not know should also not be accepted. Any evidence that the candidate has produced since your school was closed, which is significantly worse or significantly better than the performance standard they usually demonstrate, is also unlikely to be helpful.
Okay. So say a school has managed to draw on a range of evidence. How do they decide which of these carries the most weight when they're predicting grades?
Well, any evidence that you use to make your judgment must be able to be authenticated. The judgment you make is an holistic one, taking into account multiple sources of evidence if they're available to you. Where different pieces of evidence about your candidate relate to different components in the syllabus, different papers in the syllabus, then the syllabus document will indicate what weighting you should attach to each component, and you should factor that in to your overall judgment. If different pieces of evidence demonstrate different levels of performance in the same area of the syllabus, you should decide which level of performance represents the candidate's usual level of performance based on your understanding of that candidate.
Okay. And does Cambridge have any guidance on appropriate methods for gathering evidence for predicting grades?
You can consider evidence you have from saved work a candidate has produced. You might have copies of work they've produced electronically, or you might be able to access their hard copy work from over the duration of the course. Evidence from your mark books and from communications with parents or carers might also be useful to you.
Rachel, what should centres do if they cannot physically get into their school to access the evidence due to the lockdown?
We know that centres might have incomplete evidence because of the lockdown, and the range and amount of evidence might vary between subjects and between schools. You should make the best use of the evidence that's available to you to form your judgments. If you don't have access to a particular piece of evidence and you don't have a record of it, then you may not be able to use it to determine your candidate's predicted grade. But we hope that you'll be able to find other evidence that's appropriate to use to determine this predicted grade.
Let's talk about mock exams now. Would you say that one set of mocks or a single piece of evidence is sufficient to predict a grade?
Well, ideally, subject teachers will have access to more than one source of evidence for each of their candidates. This means that their judgment in determining the predicted grade can be as fair to the candidate as possible, taking into account their performance in a range of different contexts. Performance in mock exams is useful evidence, but it can be affected by the circumstances in which the candidate produced the response, and it may not fully reflect their abilities in all aspects of the syllabus. If a subject teacher feels that a candidate's mock performance was not characteristic for them, they may decide to base their judgment on other suitable evidence instead. If mock exam performance is the only evidence available to the subject teacher, then the teacher should determine the candidate's predicted grade based on the mock exam result.
If the centre does not have the physical mock scripts, but does have a record of the marks or grades they awarded, will this be acceptable to predict the grade?
Yes, marks awarded to candidates can be suitable evidence. But again, the subject teacher should determine whether these marks represent the most likely grade the candidate would have received if the exams had taken place. And ideally, review these marks alongside other evidence they have of the candidate's performance. If we ask you to produce this evidence and to send it to us, it would be helpful if you were able to send us a copy of the candidate's paper as well as the marks if it's available to you.
And can centres conduct additional mocks or tests or assessments remotely to gather new evidence here?
Any work that you use to determine the candidate's predicted grade must be able to be authenticated, as we've talked about before. So work produced remotely since your school was closed may be more difficult to authenticate. We're making no requirement for candidates to complete additional work for the predicted grade to be determined, but there may be good educational reasons for keeping candidates engaged in academic work. As I said, we talked earlier about how you might authenticate work a candidate is completing remotely. You can check in with your candidates regularly about their progress. You can ask them to submit their draft work to you electronically, and you can review that where appropriate, and you can supervise your candidates' work online with systems with video capability, provided you've been given the necessary permissions to do this.
So thinking about how Cambridge International is going to use schools' evidence, schools know that we're asking them to send in their predicted grades for candidates. Are we going to ask them to submit their evidence for those grades as well?
If we ask you for this evidence, it's likely to be for a sample of your candidates, and we will identify the candidates whose evidence we would like to see. We will tell you in what format we would like you to submit this evidence to us. For the time being, please gather the evidence and form your judgments and keep hold of this evidence.
And do centres need to annotate the work as normal that might be used for evidence in case Cambridge International asks for it to justify a predicted grade?
Annotations of work and notes to justify the decisions that subject teachers have made are likely to be useful in helping subject teachers to determine the predicted grades for their candidates. If we ask you to submit this evidence to us, you should also send us any annotation you've made on the work, but we're not asking you to produce any annotations that you would not otherwise have produced.
So thinking back to all that evidence again, you mentioned that schools will need to keep hold of it. How long are we advising centres to retain their evidence for?
You should retain the evidence that you use to inform your predicted grades and rank orders until candidates' results have been certificated.
And does that evidence need to be stored securely in that time?
Well, wherever possible, please store your evidence securely, but we know that standard storage facilities might not be available to you if you're working remotely. You should make sure that the evidence is saved and can be sent to us if we ask you to do so.
Okay. Well, thank you, Rachel. I hope this has been helpful to people watching. Thank you for your patience as we've developed and communicated our steps in setting grades for students. If you have any other questions about Cambridge International's response to COVID-19, please visit cambridgeinternational.org/COVID. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.